All right, I've been gone for like 4 or 5 days. Went to TwitchCon, tried to run into Zealand, didn't find him, unfortunately. I know some of you guys were looking forward to that. Got sick, came back, and had some other stuff that I kind of needed to work on. And as you know, this channel is when I have the opportunity to sit down and rant about things, and I just haven't been given that opportunity. So I hope that you haven't starved to death in the meantime. Fortunately for me, though, there are a lot of things that have happened. Right, there are a lot of things that have happened. Hold on, I forgot to start the recording on my screen capture. So in order to entertain you, I will perform an interpretive dance. Okay, it's loaded. One of the biggest things that happened while I was away that I wanted to talk about immediately was Mielby actually went on to win the league. Now, for those that don't remember, quick lore dump, Mjallby is a team from a town of 800 people, right? Genuinely 800 people. The peninsula has a few thousand on it, right? But the town specifically that the team is from is 800. The area like 1,500. You know, you're losing the forest for the trees when you start debating that, because the point is they're from an area of Sweden that is really fucking small, far away from any major metropolitan center. And yet they managed to win the Swedish league despite less than 10 years ago. Like, if you don't know the whole story, it is kind of mind-blowing. But I think the ESPN article had something about this, right? In 2016, here it is. Having almost been wiped out of existence while playing in the Swedish third tier in 2016, the club has operated on a meager budget, which they have bolstered by nurturing youth talent and moving them on to bigger clubs. And this, to me, is what makes this story so particularly mind-blowing. Is the dramatic percent resource difference that's on display with Mjallby's win over the rest of the Swedish league. Because when you look at the Swedish league, right, we'll pull up the table. When you look at the Swedish league, teams like Malmö, teams like Djurgården, teams like BK Häcken and Elfsborg that play in Europe consistently have access to so much more money, so much more collateral, to be able to bring in more talented players and accomplish things, right? Hammarby, these teams, they just have a lot more money. And I'm going to say something. Money relative, okay? I've got an argument for and an argument against why this is actually more impressive than the Leicester City thing. And I'm going to start with the argument for, because I'd like to end on a note that triggers less people, because I'm aware that saying this is crazier than Leicester City is going to trigger a lot of people, because the odds makers clearly didn't know how to appropriately mark the odds of Leicester City winning the league, so they made them 5,000 to 1, right? And I, as well as everybody else, has just this incredibly fond memory of what Leicester City was able to accomplish, because it marked this stemming the tide of the football in general becoming overly top-heavy, which, to be perfectly honest, it's been an overly top-heavy sport for the vast majority of its existence. We just pretend that that wasn't the case before oil money got involved. The argument for this being more impressive than Leicester is the relative turnover of Mjallby compared to the teams they're finishing above. Because you can say whatever you want around the Premier League, right? And the Premier League obviously has huge wealth inequality. It doesn't have as big a wealth inequality as maybe you see in a league like La Liga from top to bottom, because it distributes its money a little bit better. This allows for a little bit more parity, and it allows for a team like Leicester, which have been able to sustain, albeit barely in the season before they won the league, in the Prem for a couple of seasons, build up that kind of Premier League capital, that Premier League spending base on your balance sheet, and then be able to sit down and go actually spend that money. The gap in terms of the amount of money able to be spent by the teams at the top of the Prem in the era of FFP here, which is what we're, obviously this is more quantifiable in the era of FFP, the gap is not nearly as big as it is between Mjallby and Malmö, which is the, biggest money team in Sweden. They've obviously had a very disappointing domestic season. You're closing in on the final 3 matches of the season. Looks like they're going to end up in 4th place in the league, which sucks for them. But I'll see if I can actually find the numbers for you, because that's what's going to help make this more real. Or maybe you just don't believe me. Okay, took me longer than I probably bargained for. I had to actually do some fucking work for this, but ended up finding right? The highest turnover in Sweden, which was BK Häcken, which this past year was 450 million Swedish kroner. The year before was 500 million. Now that translates to basically like 52 to 54 million US dollars as a conversion. So you're looking at a little below that for euros, and then that's probably like 20 pounds. I don't fucking know. And then you look at Mjallby's turnover being just like money in the club, right? Their turnover was 9 million US dollars, or 84.7 million Swedish kroner. Obviously, I need a calculator for this. If you take the turnover of the biggest club in the league and divide it by the turnover of Mielby, you end up with BK Häcken, Malmo, those types of teams they have 6 times the amount of money to work with that Mielby does. 6 times. That you take the amount of money that Mielby has to work with and you multiply it by fucking 6. And you get to the biggest clubs in Sweden. Now, you might be thinking, well, 6 times, that's not that much, right? If you have turnover of 100 million, 6 times that is 600 million. There are very few leagues in the world that can create that type of a disparity, right? And obviously a contributing factor to that is Mjallby's this unique team that is comfortable working on this youth development shoestring budget that's able to build up these types of teams. I mean, one of the articles I read talked about the majority of the players live in the same apartment block, right? They create this kind of camaraderie, right? It's almost like a sleepaway camp. You're playing for Mielby the whole time. Everybody's living in the same place. You see your teammates getting ice in the hallway, right? It's a completely different idea from what professional football is for even somebody at Malmo or BK Häcken, where you probably got a nice house somewhere that you're living at instead, right? It's just different. It's completely different. And, for relativity in the Premier League, and I've gone into a couple of the articles, but this is the best visual way for it to be shown. This is the 2015-2016 season, right? This is Leicester, just in case you were wondering. I just figured I don't know why I felt the need to pull that up, but just in case you doubted me. The lowest was Bournemouth. They had an 88 million pound turnover, right? And then other clubs, Chelsea had 335 million pounds as a turnover. But of course, Leicester wasn't the lowest, right? Leicester was not actually the lowest team there. Leicester was 15th. They were the 15th biggest wage bill. That's not a direct correlation to turnover, but it's close enough. Right, so Bournemouth was at the bottom. They were just a smidge, under 90 million pounds. The other big clubs were somewhere between 300 and 450 million pounds. So at most, the difference between Leicester and the clubs at the top of the Premier League at the time of Leicester's championship in terms of turnover, financial firepower, permissible financial firepower under FFP, not counting Manchester City's allegedly blatant cheating, was like 3.5 times as much. What we're looking at for what Mjallby has accomplished is twice that in terms of just base financial disparity. The difference in the amount of money you have to work with relative to the teams you are beating, Mjallby's is more impressive. Inarguably more impressive. Right? It's significant. This isn't splitting hairs here. Mjallby's got $9 million worth of turnover. It is beating teams you have heard of. That's normally not the case. And not San Marino here, right? Malmo's where Zlatan Ibrahimovic came up. Malmo, Djurgården's, BK Häcken. This is where the good Swedish players come from. Not Mjallby. Now, Mjallby, despite this, have been a mid-table team for a couple of years, right? And that is part of the other half. I told you there were 2 arguments here. One is the argument for why Mjallby's is more impressive, and the other one is the argument for why it is not. Mielby has consistently been a mid-table team for a while, like 3 or 4 seasons, right? And that last year they were definitely a top half of the league team. Now, did anybody in their right mind think they had the firepower to go do what they've managed to do this season? No, nobody did. I mean, obviously, nobody was picking it, and everybody's stunned that Mielby actually went on to win this. But they were certainly a better team than Leicester was on the field relative to the people they were playing against coming into the season. Leicester had almost gotten relegated the season before, probably should have been relegated, but pulled a rabbit out of a hat, and then went on to win the league, the next year. Well, Mjallby clearly built a team over a significant period of time that methodically climbed the table like somebody playing Football Manager or something. Right? Like that's what Mjallby was doing. Their team on the field, which sounds weird, right? But football is so much about the stuff that doesn't happen on the field in terms of being able to build a team success. And that's the focus of why this is more impressive than Leicester. But on the field, it's not. Because Mjallby was one of the best 6 or 7 teams in Sweden for a little while. Right? Certainly one of the most consistent top half teams. Right? At least a consistent top flight team in a comfortable way, much longer than Leicester had been. It's just that it kind of makes it even more impressive considering the financial disparity they were working with. Because you would imagine, especially in the first couple of seasons, right, that Mielby was sticking around. Like, we just go back the last 2 seasons, they were 5th last year. They were 10th the year before in that 16-team league, but they were 15 points ahead of the relegation zone. Like, there's no real danger there. Consider the fact that they were doing this at a level financially that was probably way lower than where they're at now. It is an unbelievable victory for this. There's one other part to this argument before I kind of button it up. And that part is that Mielby, while having a lot less money to work with, is competing against worse players. Let's not ignore this, right? Even though the turnover difference is twice as big for Mielby as it was to Leicester, it's a lot easier to find ridiculously cheap, talented players that can compete with Malmo than it is to find relatively cheap players that can compete with Liverpool, Manchester City, and Arsenal, right? It just is. Leicester managed to find N'Golo Kante, right? They managed to find Jamie Vardy. They managed to find Riyad Mahrez. Bring those guys in under the radar, and they were good enough to go and win the league. For Mjallby, there are more players that exist in the world that they can get on their budget in order to beat the teams they need to beat than there were for Leicester in order for them to beat the teams they needed to beat. I feel very comfortable in saying that. So even though the financial disparity is greater, the potential base of players that you could bring in, despite that financial disparity, is also greater because of who you have to go beat. But in no way do I mean to discredit what they accomplished by saying that, because if you were in the same conversation as Leicester City, you've done something unbelievable. And half of that argument is that Mjallby was just better at being good than Leicester was, relative to their league. Because Mjallby's been safe ahead of relegation for, I think it's like 4 or 5 years. And they built towards this. They were 5th last season. And honestly, people like me should be making videos about the fact that they were 5th. Because they're from such a small town. Because they were a club that was almost disbanded 8 years ago because of financial issues, and they didn't get some giant sugar daddy that came in and just bailed them out. They found their way out of it with visionary leadership, excellent coaching, excellent transfer business. They found a way out. And it's super damn impressive what they've managed to accomplish. Is it better than Leicester? I'm going to go no because of the last part of that argument that I had. But that doesn't mean you can't celebrate it as one of the coolest things. Here, I'm going to switch it back so we can see them on top again. That doesn't mean you can't celebrate it as one of the coolest things that's happened in football in a long time. And it should be an inspiration to every club that's in a 3rd division somewhere and about to go bankrupt, that if you can get your balance sheet under control and change the way you approach football, you can do this. The players are out there. It is possible. You just have to believe that you can and then make the right decisions, which is way harder than it sounds.